Welcome. Thank you very much, Carmen. I always forget to do that. I would like to first begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on this morning. I myself am coming to you from those of the Matagami and Matachewan First Nations within the Treaty 9 territory. We do this acknowledgement to recognize the importance of the land, which we each call home, and we do this also to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. The Chamber continues to advocate for Indigenous issues so that Timmins can continue to walk the path of reconciliation together. We acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, particularly our two spirit leaders, as we look to Pride Month across the region. Welcome to our session entitled Building Inclusive Workplaces with Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, under our Diversity and Inclusion pillar, proudly supported by Ontario Power Generation. This pillar, of course, for those of you that have followed along, has allowed our businesses to explore difficult discussions and provide a framework for inclusion to promote diversity within our community. The Chamber believes it's the benefit that diversity brings, and it's in the recognition and understanding that diversity of thought contributes to the formation of strong businesses and organizations. We hope to explore how the most innovative and successful businesses, communities, and economies are the most diverse through workshops that provide tangible outcomes such as the one today. So, without further ado, I do want to extend a special thank you to Ontario Power Generation for supporting today's session and to all of you for joining us today as well. And I would like to take a moment to present today's very special guest speaker. Alita Fabiano was raised in South Porcupine, but moved to pursue her degree in communications and law at the University of Ottawa, which happens to be my alma mater, so good one. She's currently in the marketing communications manager for LRO Staffing, a recruitment agency in Ottawa. Before joining LRO, Alita worked at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce as well as the Timmins Chamber of Commerce. As an individual with single-sided deafness, Alita has made it her mission to advocate for inclusive growth so that members of underrepresented segments of the population are given an opportunity to fully participate in society. In keeping with her long-standing interest in accessibility and advocacy, Alita is a board member for the Canadian Hard of Hearing Society, or rather association, as well as the Partnership Advisory Committee member for the Government of Ontario's Employment Access Framework, or EAF project for short. Without further ado, I would like to present Alita. Take it away.
Hi, thank you, Cameron. I will just start by sharing my screen. Okay.
We did rehearse, so you've got this.
Rehearse. I'm just, yes, we rehearsed sharing the screen a couple times. I'm not the best with technology.
And you're perfect.
Okay, oops. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, it's great to be here today and speak with you guys. I have obviously an affinity for the Timmins Chamber and the community as I kind of grew up there and worked there. So I'm excited to speak to you guys today about building an inclusive workplace. So we'll just start off a bit by talking about the benefits of doing such. So the unemployment rate for Canadians in general sits around 5%, but then it increases to 35% for those with mild disabilities and 74% with those with severe disabilities. So there's been a very large gap thus far in kind of creating those accessible workspaces where everyone can actually partake in the workforce. So while for businesses, accessibility is a key consideration in their operations, for Canadians with disabilities, it is a fundamental component in shaping both their personal and professional lives. Individual disabilities add incredible value to any organization, especially considering their job retention rates are 72% higher than the average Canadian. So as some of the most resilient individuals, their lived experiences can also lead to the unique forms of problem solving, heightened empathy, and valuable insights that can really contribute to an organization. It's also been proven that diverse and inclusive workplaces lead to a higher level of trust and improved productivity with employees, as well as higher revenue growth and an increased likelihood of outperforming less diverse competitors. As mentioned, though, the unemployment rate is drastically higher than the national average. So these individuals are really an untapped pool of talent waiting to join our workforces, but just haven't been able to due to lack of accessibility. So in order to access this talent, Businesses need to eliminate any barriers that are within their control, as well as create a more inclusive work culture. So now we'll just get in to the AODA. So Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Essentially, it was created to help eliminate those barriers for people with disabilities. The government has this legislation, which ensures that organizations are doing their part to make their environment more accessible to all through its regulations. The way this is regulated is through self-assessment. But the government can appoint an inspector or launch an investigation to see if the standards are being met. So it's important that you kind of operate on good faith with this and stay up to date with the regulations. So it is made up of 5 standards: customer service standard, information and communication standard, employment standard, transportation standard, and design of public space standard. So these are kind of just goals businesses should be striving for. And I'll go over which each of the 5 and how they're made up. So the customer service standard mandates that service providers must find ways to break down barriers that prevent customers with disabilities from accessing the services they need. So basically, barriers go beyond just the physical obstacles that you may assume, and they can include technology, information, communication, and an organization's procedures, the attitudes of staff members. It really encompasses a lot. So just as people with disabilities deserve equal opportunities to serve their communities through equal employment, they should also have equal opportunities to be served in ways that respect their needs and wishes. This standard ultimately just ensures that people with disabilities have their independence and dignity respected. So information and communication standard of the AODA lists rules for organizations to create, provide, and receive information that people with disabilities can access. The standards give all people an equal chance to learn and be active in their communities. This includes having accessible formats such as large print font, braille, text transcriptions of videos, or audio files for text. It also includes having communication supports when needed. This could be having a sign language interpreter for virtual events, closed captioning, even just rephrasing things in plain, clear language. So it includes a lot just to kind of simplify and break down those barriers. It also includes having a process for people to submit feedback to your organization that's accessible. So by providing contact information by phone or email rather than handwritten forms, that's one way to do accessible feedback. Because whether it's traveling, working, or shopping, how we receive information is imperative to every facet of our lives. So it's really just important that we're making sure that everyone can actually understand and enjoy our services. So for the employment standard, it requires that employers must make their workplace and employment practices accessible to potential or current employees with disabilities. This includes having non-discriminatory hiring practices, as well as employers must tell applicants that they can ask for accommodations for the interview or assessment, regardless if they self-disclose as having a disability. So it's really just creating that kind of transparent interview practice or environment that people feel comfortable to disclose. And when they do, ensuring that everything is made available to them in a way that's accessible. It also is important that employees hired with a disability are accommodated as mentioned, but that they would also have an individual accommodation plan, because disability looks different for everybody and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So by having an accommodation plan that is specific to your employee, it helps set them up for long-term success and what they may need or what obstacles they may need to help overcome. This is important because employers can often overlook candidates with disabilities or kind of overlook employees that may not vocalize their struggles because they don't understand how capable people with disabilities are. But this standard aims to kind of eliminate those unconscious bias and help bridge a path to success for people with disability in the workplace. So for the transportation standard, this section applies to transportation service providers only. So it doesn't apply to most organizations, but it's something to keep in mind. This ensures that there are accessible options available upon request for transportation. So this could include safe transit stops, priority seating. It's also, as transportation is a vital part of living, it's important that people with disabilities have access to get around and have these supports. So while this doesn't apply to most businesses, it's maybe something you want to consider when choosing your offices and making sure that there is accessible transportation to bring people to your offices, whether they're working or just enjoying your services. So something to keep in mind, but something that doesn't directly apply to most organizations that need to conform to the AODA. All right, so then the design of public spaces standard just basically describes ways to make communal spaces more accessible. This can include like an office building with an elevator instead of just stairways, having a park with a paved walkway rather than gravel for those with mobility issues, having nearby parking to your office. They're just all things to consider when designing your space. This standard only applies to new construction projects. So if you're planning on renovating your office, then these standards would apply. Or if you were building a new office, they do not apply to existing offices as is. That said, it's something that all businesses should work to improve upon or nonetheless. So yeah, okay. So those are the 5 standards. And now we'll move on to about the requirements themselves. So requirements differ depending on the number of employees you have. They're broken down to less than 20 employees, 20 to 49 employees, and more than 50 employees. If you're self-employed, you are exempt from the AODA standards. That said, working towards becoming accessible is always a good thing to do, especially if you have plans to expand your business. It's also worth noting that when counting employees, it doesn't matter if they're part-time or temporary, they still count towards your employee count. So here is what's required for fewer than 20 employees. You're going to want to create policies that help you achieve your accessibility goals, train all your employees and volunteers on the Ontario Human Rights Code, accessible customer service, and any accessibility requirements that apply to their duties. Provide customer service to people with disabilities that allow them to access your goods or services. Plan for accessible self-service kiosks if applicable. And this is a newer addition to the regulations as we're seeing more of those given the pandemic and just technology. Accommodate employees with disabilities through their employment under the Ontario Human Rights Code. Provide accessible information upon request, and create accessible public spaces. Moving on to additional employees, the only way these really change, all of the previous requirements still apply to 20 and up employees, but for 20 to 49, you will also need to file an accessibility compliance report every 3 years, similar for above 50 employments and employees. And then you'll also need to create a multi-year accessibility plan and make all public websites accessible. While some of these requirements that I've mentioned are obvious, such as human rights training and providing accessible customer service, other elements are more subjective as to how they can be implemented. So for that reason, I'm going to go over how to audit your current practices, create a policy, accessible digital communications, as well as ensuring your hiring practices are inclusive. Because that's the thing with the AODA, it's very subjective. It's up to your own interpretation how you want to apply it, and you're being held to somewhat of your own standards. So with the subjective nature, I think it's important to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of how to achieve it. So accessibility components to evaluate. When it comes to creating an accessible workplace, you'll want to keep in mind your physical workplace, digital workplace, and overall human resource practices. The physical workplace includes components that may affect how someone is able to use your facilities. Maybe the doorways are too narrow for people if they have a mobility device. If your elevators have braille buttons for people with visual impairments, there's a lot of things to keep in mind here. So knowing these details, no matter how small they are, will help you guide to make your workplace accessible to everyone. The digital workplace refers to the interactive features and functionalities of your work. This could include technologies and devices you use to do your work, the accessibility of your website, any assistive technology that's available, etc. So anything technology kind of to do your job or for someone to access the services that will play into that. And then lastly are the human resources practices that accompany this. We need to ensure that the organization is being held accountable to these standards and that someone has ownership of overseeing the physical and digital workplaces to ensure that all individuals are able to be included within the organization. So HR practices will kind of help set the fundamental to make sure everything else is being followed. Okay, so how to audit your current accessibility practices. You'll want this done by either the owner of the business, an HR professional, or by hiring a third party who specializes in this. If it is done internally, you'll want to define the scope of your evaluation. This should evaluate both the physical and digital workplaces. So for physical, it could include accessing areas like parking, entrances and exits, doorways and hallways, elevators, stairways, offices, restrooms, signage. For the digital workplace, you'll want to evaluate how accessible your software application and operating systems are, your website, the computers provided, video projects, and other telecommunications projects. And then next, you'll want to select a representative sample to test out the accessibility of these areas. And from there, you would report your findings and fix any accessibility issues there may be. If they aren't all easy fixes, and chances are they won't be, you'll want to create a plan and a timeline for how and when they'll be addressed. And then lastly, you'll want to perform continued testing and maintain or update features as needed. Accessibility and what that looks like is always changing. So the most important thing here is just a willingness to learn and adapt. And so just continually checking to make sure things are up to date will go a long way. All right, so as you write your, oh, sorry. I started without doing the intro. So creating accessibility policies. So as mentioned, that cornerstone and the fundamentals of really creating an accessible workplace will be through its policy and those guidelines that all employees, hiring managers, and anyone can follow. So you'll want to create those policies. And you'll start with writing a statement of commitment. So as you write your statement of commitment, consider your organization's vision, overall goals, and its current level of accessibility. Think about the accessibility message you want to convey to your employees and the public. So this can be a mix of both looking what you have done, but what you aspire to do. And then you'll want to, next you'll want to assess gaps in your current policies. So what I just went over with auditing your current accessibility, that'll help identify those gaps. And perhaps you don't have any existing policies on accessibility, and that's okay. But knowing where you need to improve is the first step. From there, you'll create new policies, and yeah, so you'll create your new policies, and then you'll want to surround those new policies with the 5 areas of the AODA standards. So that's a good basis. So when you're creating your new policies, try to include about customer service, communication, employment, design of public space, and transportation if applicable. These are always a good cornerstone when trying to guide what you're trying to achieve. And then lastly, you'll want to share those policies with both your employees and publicly. So you could post this information on your website or in your reception area. But once again, it's important to remember that any information needs to be in an accessible format if asked. So you'll want to have an accessible format available to share if it is something that's only on your website. Okay. And as I've mentioned, accessible formats and websites from there is talking about accessible digital communications. So accessible communication uses inclusive design to make it possible for people of all abilities to fully experience your marketing efforts, and ultimately gives people with disabilities the same opportunities as able-bodied people. So it's really important that this is followed with all your online presence. While incorporating accessible digital communications may seem like a daunting task, it's most easily achieved by keeping in mind the experience of those with vision, hearing, motor, or communicative impairments. This helps you to better understand the barriers that they may face and help you to make adjustments to your digital communications to ensure it's inclusive. So when I'm going to write a blog or I'm adding a new page to a website, the first thing I keep in mind is I ask myself these questions to assess how to move forward. So what movements will a user need to perform to interact with your content? This can just kind of be the usability. Is it user-friendly, your website? How many clicks? Is it kind of intuitive to follow? You'll also, what is a user seeing that they may need explained in order to better understand your content? So for someone that's visually impaired, they might not understand what's happening in an infographic or an image. So you'll want to have alt text on your images, things like that, or closed captioning on your videos. So some sort of alternative way to understand the content. Another question is, what sounds does your content produce in order for a user to understand it? So as I just mentioned, closed captioning for sound or descriptions for images. And then how easy is it to interpret your content? That kind of revolves around using that plain language. So these are just questions I keep in mind to assess if what I'm creating digitally really is accessible. So whether you're writing content for your website, social media, or email campaigns, it's important that it is inclusive. You'll want to keep in mind the structure of your writing. So if there's headings in your body text, you'll want to use the H2 tag instead of just enlarging your font. That way it's accessible to those with visual impairments using a screen reader. This helps make your content easier to follow. Additionally, you'll want to use descriptive link text rather than just saying click here. It's good to say click here to download a tip sheet so that if someone's using a screen reader, they understand the whole action associated with the hyperlink text. When it comes to accessing files or links, you'll want to make sure that those documents are accessible as well. And lastly, you'll want to keep your sentences short and avoid jargon so that it's simple to read for those with cognitive impairments. An accessible design ensures that everyone can understand the meaning of your visual content from videos to images. So similar to content accessibility, inclusive design principles appeal to all types of digital communications, such as your website, social media, email. All videos should have closed captioning as message to accommodate someone with a hearing impairment, and a descriptive transcript of a video so that anyone can understand any of the visual aspects to the video. As mentioned, there's alt text and description of images, so someone using a screen reader can consume that content as well. Continuing with the design perspective, alt text should be easy to read so that it's inclusive. Ensure that font colors and background colors are high contrast for those with a visual impairment. If you're unsure of which color combinations you've chosen are high contrast enough, there's you can Google contrast checker online, and there's a bunch of tools that are just free and easy to use to double check these things. When it comes to fonts, you should always stick to one font type that is clear to read and spaced out, like Times New Roman or Arial. There's a reason those are the default on Word and emails and such like that, and it's because they are easy to read. And you'll always want to make sure you can use as large of a font size as possible. And it's important that if you're wanting to emphasize a word, you would use a bold to emphasize a word rather than italics, because italics are can be difficult to read for visually impaired individuals. And while content and design are key components of making your communications accessible, there are other factors to it as well. You should focus on, when revamping a website, you should focus on keyboard navigation that allows users to tab through menus, buttons, and other elements for those who have visual or motor disabilities and cannot use a mouse or trackpad. Buttons are critical to marketing success oftentimes, and as such, you'll want to make sure they're accessible as well. By adding accessible rich internet applications or ARIA attributes to your HTML, you can give screen readers the proper information they need to complete an action. With this in mind, though, having accessible buttons may require help from a website development team, so some things will be out of your scope when it comes to digital communications. It's just important to do what you can and keep this in mind and know when to outsource when needed. And lastly, if your business has a storefront location, most websites have an About Us or a Find Us section. So it's important to mention whether or not it's a physically accessible location on those pages, so that people with disabilities aren't faced with unforeseen barriers when they should choose to visit your business. If your business isn't accessible by any method other than stairs, that's something you would want to mention, so that someone with a mobility device doesn't show up and isn't able to enter. So it's important to keep as much information as possible on your website. Okay. And last but not least, when considering how to be more accessible, and this is arguably one of the most inclusive elements, it's how to make your hiring process inclusive for people with disabilities. So it really does start from the bottom, and hiring is one of the most important things in becoming inclusive, because the more diverse our workforce is, the more you're going to have that diversity of perspectives, and it'll just be really second nature to have that inclusive environment. So it really does begin with inclusiveness in hiring. So you'll want to make sure that you are checking your own personal bias when hiring. So many hiring managers subconsciously hire candidates who are similar to them in how they speak or look without realizing that mindset. And that can often exclude a lot of candidates, such as people with disabilities. So there is also a fear and stigmas associated with having a disability. So the way to combat these preconceived notions is to first acknowledge them, and then to educate yourself and your employees on how people with disabilities are just differently abled and are still extremely skilled individuals. It's important that you treat people with disabilities as you would anyone else. So use regular tone of voice and speed while talking, unless they request otherwise. And always speak directly to the person with a disability and not their support person, should they have one. Many candidates look for career opportunities online. Therefore, it's important that your job postings are accessible as well in order to attract candidates. And you'll just want to make sure the layout and content of your websites and job postings follow the accessible communications that I had just outlined. Next, you'll also want to present opportunities for a person with a disability to enclose. Often knowing when or how to disclose disability to a potential employer is an extremely stress-inducing situation. It's easy to worry about facing judgment or seeming like an undesirable candidate. So one way to break down that barrier is by asking if they need any special accommodation for a disability when arranging the interview. This opens up the line of communication on the subject, should they want to disclose their disability. But it's important to remember, though, that not every person with a disability will want to disclose it, and that's all right. Should they disclose or not, an interviewer should never pry or ask invasive questions. The way to ensure that you're still being inclusive is to always have accessible interviews, regardless if a person discloses or not, to make it an equal playing field. provide interview information in advance. So in order to set someone up with a disability up to succeed, it's important to give them as much information as possible in advance so they can process it and have time to request accommodation if needed. Try to provide written or visual instructions on aspects of the interview, like how to reach your office, what to do when they arrive, as well as an agenda for the interview itself, which includes the names and roles of the interviewers. And then just remember to address the process as needed. The main aspect of always being inclusive is a willingness to accommodate. As such, it's important to adjust the interview process as needed in order to provide an accessible interview format. Some candidates may request to have a telephone interview rather than face-to-face due to mobility or other impairments, while someone with a hearing impairment may want to do a video interview rather than a telephone one so that they can read lips. Additionally, when doing a video interview, it's important to choose a platform that offers live closed captioning or transcripts to further dismantle any possible barriers. You will also want to be more flexible on the timing of your interview. Some people with disabilities focus best at certain times of the day and will want to have that accommodated as well. Despite making the interview process as accessible as possible, some people with disabilities will still face challenges, which is why it's important to ask literal questions during the interview rather than hypothetical, and also give them an opportunity to demonstrate their skills to you in other ways, such as skills-based tests, questionnaires, or having them perform tasks that the role would require. Before a candidate comes into the office for an interview, you'll also want to make sure the environment is not only accessible to their specific disability, but accessible for all disabilities, as not everyone will disclose. Here are some accommodations that can be made to be more inclusive towards people with disabilities. An accessible location, a quiet location, good lighting, a seating arrangement where the candidate can see the interviewer clearly, advanced copies of the interview questions for someone with a cognitive impairment, an ASL interpreter for someone with a hearing impairment. If not all the aforementioned accommodations can be made, it's important to state, as mentioned with your website, it's important to state the accessibility of your physical location during your correspondence and offer to host the interview virtually or at an alternate location to accommodate someone's needs. And lastly, remember to offer continued support. Being an inclusive workplace doesn't end at the interview process. As we've discussed today, it's important that your company takes steps needed to continue its accessibility and promote diversity. If there are employees who develop a disability or who are hired with a disability, it's important to offer them support and the resources they need to succeed and champion your business. Ultimately, businesses have truly embraced creating a more diversified workplace where individual contributions are valued. However, a truly inclusive workplace is always a work in progress. And as such, there always needs more learning and understanding to be done. What accessibility looks like now may change in 5, 10, 15 years, and that's okay. The important part is having individuals who are willing to do the work, to adapt their practices, and ultimately that will lead to longer success for your business and as well. So really, it's in the best interest of not only your business and Canadians as a whole, but for our economy to really be more inclusive. So with that said, I'll hand it back over to Cameron as we have some time for questions. I know that I've kind of went through a lot of information with you guys today and a lot of different components to consider when it comes to accessibility. So I'm definitely happy to answer questions and break down anything that needs more clarification.
Thank you very much, Alita. And before we go to Bill at OPG, we do want to provide an opportunity for anybody on the call today to ask questions if you have any, given the very in-depth presentation, but still graspable, I have to say. The one thing I did note, Alita, is that something that I believe Chamber recently went through was the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, was even something as simple as making sure that you update your Google business hours. Because if that person, tends to look, makes the hassle of going there, and gets there and recognizes that your business is closed, and they have, an accessible issue, then then that's been a lot harder for them to do. So something just as simple as that. And the color, the contrast checker, that's a good tip as well. So I really appreciate that. But yes, does anybody have a question for Alita?
Yeah, sorry, I'll chime in on that quickly. You're absolutely right, though. As much as it can seem, accommodation can seem like a big word and really hard to achieve, it really is a lot of times a lot of smaller, simpler actions. Like you said, updating the Google business listing, checking for color contrast. Even I recently heard that the three most accommodations that people with disabilities ask for are like ergonomic chairs, flexible work hours. So, and I'll be honest, I forget the third, but it's not an expensive cost to being accessible. A lot of times people worry about the cost of business or how much work it's gonna cost, take them. And it really is a low cost. It just requires kind of thinking through and a lot of smaller actions into the day-to-day.
Excellent. Well, you're certainly welcome to write them in the chat. And I know that Alita has been kind enough to share her email with us. So if you have any questions, we can certainly share the presentation afterwards. I'm assuming.
Yes, yes.
I'm obligating you, yes. But beyond that, I think, again, especially in the workforce shortages that we're facing these days, I think that understanding how AODA policies that, just as you said, are very easy to implement, are a viable and meaningful way to grow your workforce. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And, especially with the workforce shortages and labor constraints that we see, really having that discussion at the business level, as much as you are as an owner and operator, a leader within your workplace, you have that opportunity to have that conversation. And so, Alita, I do want to just take a moment to pass it to Bill, who's going to bring some words on behalf of OPG. Bill, you've got the floor.
Thanks, Cam. Alita, introduce myself. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a stakeholder relations advisor for Northeast Operations with Ontario Power Generation. And OPG is proud to support the diversity and inclusion pillar, and namely the AODA policies that are incredibly important and meaningful to growing the workforce, but also acknowledging that some disabilities are not always visible. I would like to thank you for your time and your presentation today and look forward to sharing what I've learned with my network. So thank you very much.
All right.
And I'll turn it back to you, Cam.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Bill. Thank you very much. We do appreciate your
Not
support.
a problem.
This is a big one to tackle, and OPG is just the right size to get done. So that's excellent. Please keep in mind, we do have some sessions coming up in the future. You can always check what we have coming up, not only on the community calendar that we have on our website, but also the Timmins Chamber calendar of events. Most are happening in person, but we do have these hybrid sessions as well. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you for joining us today. Alita, the discussion doesn't end here. We've got lots of work ahead of us, and I thank you all for joining us and stepping up and being leaders on the AODA charge. So with that, have a safe and wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Cam.
Oh, and thank you very much, Sarah, for those who are left. It is National Accessibility Week. That is very true. And tomorrow is Red Shirt Day. So keep that in mind. There you go, Sarah.
Have a good day, guys.
Bye now.